Okay, everyone, welcome to our April Guilford 250 lecture series. This lecture series is being presented by Preservation Greensboro. Just a few facts. Everyone who is on here via Zoom is muted and your videos are disabled. We cannot hear or see you, but we know that you are here and we wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. We are recording the webinar. It will be on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube page. If you have any technical issues, please utilize the chat function and I will do my best to help you with any tech problems. Again, this is presented by Preservation Greensboro, Guilford County's only non-governmental membership organization focused on architectural history. Just a few how-tos. We have a chat function and we have a Q&A function. The chat function is mainly to talk between the group. So if you want to talk to me, if you want to talk to somebody else who is also here, that is where you can have your own conversations. The Q&A is where we ask that if you have any questions for Rebecca, you send them through the Q&A function. And at the end, when we have our Q&A session, Benjamin or I will be able to read her questions. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Benjamin.
Thank you for the introduction, Catherine, and happy birthday to us. Guilford County in April was established in April 1771. So here in April 2021, we are now officially 250 years old. So I hope that you go out and buy yourself a cupcake tomorrow and put a little candle in it. We're celebrating this milestone in our county with discussions by Zoom, nice and safe. Hopefully you're all on your way to getting vaccinated and staying safe. But in the meantime, we're doing these Zoom talks in order to learn more about our history and learn more about what our history is and what makes us unique in North Carolina. And certainly those parameters fit our Guilford County, Guilford Courthouse battleground. The battleground is a site that's special and unique. It's operated through the National Park Service. That is a trophy in our community that we have that Raleigh and Charlotte and Winston-Salem don't have. So this is something that's special to us. And as you will hear, I'm sure you all are familiar with the battle at Guilford Courthouse, but it's always nice to get some new points of perspective and some fresh information from the staff who's so professional there and helps us to better understand our own history. We have with us today Rebecca Barefoot, who has been a friend of historic preservation, a historian here in Guilford County for a number of years. She will be leading us. Her position is as a park guide at the battleground, so you might see her there if you go visit the battleground. But she is going to lead us on a review of the park, but talking about some of the special perspectives and facets that she has as a professional staff person there. So we're very fortunate to have Rebecca with us this evening and look forward to hearing her presentation. So Rebecca, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Benjamin and Catherine. We're excited to be involved in the Guilford 250 talk, and I just want to apologize in advance if I sneeze loudly. Seasonal allergies are coming in strong this time of year. So hello, everybody. I'm looking forward to talking to you all about the park, about our role as a national park, about the battle, and the ways that our history has been commemorated. So I am going to share my screen so that we can see some images. I'm not sure how many of you have been to our park before. And if you're new to Greensboro, we welcome you to come visit every day of the week. We're open from 8:30 to 5. So let's get this PowerPoint started. And I hope you all will be able to see my cursor. It is going to be a little white floating dot that I'm going to use to illustrate some parts of this PowerPoint. So as Benjamin said, we are a unit of the National Park Service. We are actually the first Revolutionary War battlefield that was designated by Congress, which is pretty cool. but the National Park Service and Congress did not start the preservation of this battlefield. That actually begins with a private organization called the Guilford Battleground Company, which we will talk about throughout this presentation. They are actually responsible for many of the memorials of the park. So if you're to come visit us at Guilford Courthouse National Military Park, you can expect to tour 250 acres of the battlefield, see 29 monuments, go along our tour road, visit our museum, and talk to us park rangers about the history of the site. And I wanted to give a quick little discussion about the battle for those of you who aren't familiar or maybe haven't seen some of these illustrations. Now, being in a time period of the American Revolution, of course, we don't have photographs to go back on to look at the battle, but we do have artistic descriptions that have been completed by artists who have studied the battle in depth. And we use those to help interpret our point about the battlefield. But what I'd like to first start with is this primary source document. This is a map of the battle, just a part of it, and it shows the order of battle, and we'll use this along with our artistic paintings to describe how the battle took place. Now, as Benjamin said, Guilford County is 250 years old, and this battle takes place on March 15th, 1781. It is a part of the Southern campaign of the American Revolution. And some of you might say, wait, the Revolution was fought here in the South? I've only ever heard about Boston, or I've only heard about Yorktown, or I've only heard about a number of other Northern battles. Well, the Southern campaign is a very critical point of the American Revolution because the British Army is split in half, and Lord Cornwallis comes to the South. He's attempting to regain Loyalist support in this area to take back from the rebelling American forces, also known as Patriots. And Lord Cornwallis is pursuing originally Horatio Gates and Daniel Morgan, but Nathaniel Greene, who was originally from Rhode Island and was a quartermaster general in Washington's army, takes command in December of 1780. And he is in a back and forth chase with Lord Cornwallis in the Southern campaign from December 1780 until March 15th, 1781, continuously evading Cornwallis, going from the Carolinas into Virginia with the famous race to the dam. Now, what makes this area significant? As you can see, this tiny little dot right here, and I'm going to zoom in slightly. This is our depiction of the courthouse. Now, this map that we're using was created by two British officers. Lieutenant Henry Haldane created the original map, and then Bannister Tarleton published this version. As you can see, the Guilford County courthouse is in woods surrounded by farm fields, and it is intersected by this historic New Garden Road. Now, this road does still exist in the park today, and you can walk it, but General Greene chooses this area after he visits the courthouse a few months before to have a meeting with his commanders. And he likes the terrain of the Guilford Courthouse community because of these open farm fields, but also these dense woods in between. And he is attempting to use his different forces at strategic moments to draw the British into his grasp. He originally wanted to attack Cornwallis, but on the day of March 15th, realized a defensive position would be more strategic. So we have different groups with us. We have the North Carolina Militia on the first line. Our modern day visitor center is in this area. We have the American second line, which would be the Virginia Militia. Now, these men would be veteran soldiers with experience, while the first line of North Carolina militia were new recruits. And then the third line would be the Continental Army. So as I said, Greene has chosen this area for battle, not for the significance of the courthouse, but the ability to use this historic New Garden Road to move his artillery and his army, and the forested environment with the open fields. Now, Lord Cornwallis does have the best army in the world. These soldiers are well battle worn, they're highly experienced, and they are still at a disadvantage number-wise because he has about 1,900 men under his command, while General Greene has 4,500. So the American first line would have been militiamen, which are your average everyday persons who are only serving for a few months at a time. They vary in age, and they don't have the skills that a continental soldier would have. So as you can see in this painting, they would have been behind a fence, a split rail fence, awaiting for the British to come along. This painting by Don Troiani actually shows the density of the forest during the time. Now, when you come to the battlefield today, the trees are a lot smaller and they're more numerous, unlike the original old growth forest of the battlefield. But as you can see, it was easier to be lost and confused in the woods, and that was part of Greene's strategy. And I'm just going to back up real quick. As you can see, between the first line and the second line, there are so many thick woods here that it would be very difficult for the British Army to keep their straight lines. Now, for anybody who's unfamiliar with fighting during the 18th century, you must stay in a straight line. That is the most ideal situation so that you can fire a single volley of musket balls to be able to successfully hit your enemy. Once you start breaking up into these small groups, you have less firepower and there's just less opportunity to do that. However, hand-to-hand combat does occur at this battle. And this is one of Don Troiani's later paintings. This is a cavalry action at the American third line. And when you all come to visit the battlefield, it'll be a lot easier to explain the different actions as you go through the park. But as we can see here, this depicts William Washington's cavalry, who surprised the British at the third line. And this ultimately led to the closing of the battle. So, in terms of preservation and how we got here, where does the Guilford Battleground Company come in? Where does the founding of this battlefield occur? As we've seen, this is what we understand the battlefield looks like. Again, farm fields, thick woods, and then a small settlement area here at the Guilford Courthouse community. We only have a few vague descriptions of the community from the different participants. But as you can see, there are people living here at this time. So part of the commemoration of battlefields comes with historian Benson Lossing visiting different battlefield sites to determine what should be marked with memorials and monuments for their preservation. So the rise of putting monuments on battlefields comes out of the time period after the Civil War, when there is a need for unity between the formerly divided states. And we'll see how that is really influence of the GBC. Now, what's pretty cool here in the bottom picture is an illustration of the Guilford Courthouse community. And we actually have some connections with Preservation Greensboro's Story of Blandwood, a Robert Lindsay, who would have been related to Letitia Moorhead. I'm sorry, Anna Liza Moorhead would have lived in this area of the Guilford Courthouse community. So, and a lot of people ask us when they come to the park, where's the courthouse? Is it still around? And unfortunately, it is not. The courthouse itself was a poorly built structure that did not last for very long. In fact, when the community of Martinville, as you see here, was created and founded by Alexander Martin, by that time, the original courthouse became dilapidated and was replaced by another one. So, to the Guilford Battleground Company, the original savers of our battlefield, we're going to talk about David Shank here. Judge David Shank moved to Greensboro and was fascinated with the Revolutionary War and had heard about the battle, studied it, but found that there weren't many people in Greensboro who could tell you where the battlefield was located. So he decided, starting around 1886, that he would start visiting the battlefield, and he wanted to purchase the grounds to redeem them from oblivion. And he formed, with several of his friends, financial partners, the Guilford Battleground Company, to start purchasing plots of land from local farmers to be able to save the battlefield. So another connection to Preservation Greensboro is Julius Gray here. I know that you can see a younger portrait of him in the Blandwood downstairs, but here he is, which is a pretty cool connection. And the GBC decided that their mission was to save the park, but there was also the benevolent purpose of preserving and adorning the grounds on and over which the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought on the 15th day of March, 1781, and the erection thereon of monuments, tombstones, or other memorials to commemorate the historic deeds of the American patriots who participated in this battle for liberty and independence. So some key words from that quote I want you all to think about is that their goal is to place monuments on the battlefield, tombstones, and memorialize the American patriots of this. On the right side, we have a picture of Shank next to the Maryland monument. So the original preservation of the GBC is going to change over time, as well as how the Park Service commemorates those who fought here. As I mentioned before, the practice of setting monuments on battlefields really came about after the Civil War, during the centennial celebrations of the American Revolution. So this was an opportunity to have a shared memory and unifying practice by using memorials related to the patriots and the commanders. And this is the No North, No South monument that the Guilford Battleground Company created to commemorate George Washington and Nathanael Greene. And it embodies the spirit of unity because the phrasing is an indication of how Washington was a Southerner who commanded the American Army in the northern states, while Greene from Rhode Island commanded the American Army in the southern states. So it's kind of obliterating that dividing line. The General Greene Monument, as you see in this picture from 1915, is our key focal point. And his monument is actually sitting in front of the American second line. So when you stand on the battlefield looking at him, there's a tree line here where the Virginia militia would have stood. Now, this monument has some pretty cool history to it because the person who designed it, Francis Herman Packer, actually studied under the sculptor for the Lincoln Memorial. It was Daniel Chester French, even though this monument was created, I think about 5 years before the Lincoln Memorial. And Francis Herman Packer, I've always heard when I first started working here that he was a perfectionist, that he spent so much detail and time sculpting, and he was even at the celebration to listen to how the crowd viewed and thought of the monument. However, he actually made a mistake. So for being a perfectionist, the uniform that he depicted Nathaniel Greene wearing is a later military style. So it does not depict the actual uniform that Greene would have worn in the Southern campaign. But I just wanted to show some not often seen pictures here of his process of designing the Nathaniel Greene Monument in his studio. And to the far right of this picture, you won't see this if you visit the battlefield. What you're looking at is a formal English gardenscape, because the Guilford Battleground Company believed that the best way to commemorate beyond adding memorials for the site was to create a sort of pleasure park for visitors. So what they did was they made a formal English garden. Whereas now the mission of the National Park Service is to restore the battlefield to look like the battlefield would have been in 1781, so you can really immerse yourself in the history. But it's just interesting to share the opportunity to see former practices. This is the Nathaniel Greene Monument today. It features the battles that he fought in. It features his own personal history, and it has an allegorical figure in the front. She very well could be Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, though she represents liberty. As you see that she has a shield that has the 13 stars. And this monument was actually in a competition, and it was selected in 1912, but it was finally assembled and presented in 1915. This is one of my favorite monuments at the park. This is for the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And this kind of gets to an interesting practice of the Guilford Battleground Company. There are several people who are interred at our park and memorialized who had nothing to do with the battle. And that goes back to the Guilford Battleground Company's mission to memorialize and commemorate the heroic deeds of American patriots. And that extends beyond those who fought. So David Shank and the Guilford Battleground Company actually had William Hooper and John Penn reinterred at our site from their original graves. Joseph Hughes is our other signer from North Carolina. He is actually in Christ Church burial ground. And I would say this is one of the more artistic artistic renditions of our monuments. As you can see, this man here is holding not only a scroll in his hand, but just kind of orating to an audience. It represents William Hooper, who was considered, along with Henry Lee, to be the orator of Congress. Another stylized monument is the Jethro Sumner Monument that you see here. And in my little description, you'll see that this is actually modeled after the Latrobe cenotaphs that you would find in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Jethro Sumner is once again another soldier who did not fight at this battle, but as you can see, he did have a connection with General Greene. And here we have yet another connection to the Moorheads. So the monument to the left, this little pup tent monument, is to James Moorhead, once again, not connected to the battle, but still important to the North Carolina continental experience. And to the right, this monument here is Joseph Motley Moorhead. He is the nephew of Governor John Motley Moorhead, and he took over the Guilford Battleground Company from David Shank. And thanks to him, he had the foresight to move the park's management into the federal service so that it could continue its preservation. This is another favorite monument of mine because I just find that it's interesting that somebody would have the opportunity to state what their memorial would look like. For those who can't read it, this is Nathaniel Macon's monument, another soldier, and he willed that his memorial should consist only of rude stones. Here they are. I think it's one of the most frank monuments I've ever seen. And as you can see, a lot of our monuments are pretty rough cut granite, with sometimes they have decorative plaques on them. This is to the Maryland soldiers. And this monument, as well as the ones I'm about to talk about, are actually not placed at the third line as we understand today. When David Shanks started purchasing property along with the Guilford Battleground Company, their property line ended a few hundred yards before the actual third line. And that's where park rangers come into play and telling people the history, not only of the memorials, but the park site itself. Now, the photograph on the left may not show this very easily, but this monument says Regulars, Green's third line. This is one of many obelisks that we have in the park. This is a common memorial type during the time of the 19th century. And the Green's third line is marked by this, but it's actually way behind it in the woods. So what does the National Park Service do? We have different wayside exhibits that tell you about the battle history and place it in the right context. Here is another monument that's located technically in the wrong place. This is to William Washington and the Marquis of Bretigny's, the cavalry, in that painting that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation of the cavalry surprising the British on the battlefield. Once again, this was thought to be the third line area, but you would have to go several hundred yards further along the battlefield. Now, as you can see in this picture, there is a slight depression in the battlefield. Today, there are actually many trees in this field. This is actually a vintage photo, but it's a good opportunity to show you the battlefield. In this little depression, Shank would have thought that this is where the British came down a hill and then saw the Continental Army to move forward. Therefore, it was clear cut to make it look like the third line. But again, this is actually not the location, and we've discovered that over time. Now, this monument has an interesting history behind it because this commemorates a British Lieutenant Colonel, Stuart, and there is a little bit of myth around his sword. We have a sword that is connected to him that was supposedly found in a log years later from the battlefield. And Stuart's story is that he got into a sword fight with an American and died on the field. So it's interesting that this is actually a memorial to a British soldier during a time that would be really focusing on just the American experience. We have two monuments to women at the park. To the left, we have a zoomed in picture of Miss Karen Happick Turner. And then to the right, we have Mrs. Martha McFarland McGee Bell. So once again, we have a connection to the Moorheads with the Karen Happick Turner monument, but there is a bit of a myth surrounding her experience, and it almost illustrates the experience many women had taking care of soldiers. The story, as you can read it, is that she heard that her young son was wounded, and she rode from horseback from Maryland home to Guilford Courthouse to nurse him back to health. And I just like to pause, let you all think about, say you're driving to Maryland now in a car, how many hours that would take? Well, now let's think about going on horseback and how long the communication would have taken. So, like I said, her story represents a lot of women being involved in taking care of wounded soldiers. Now, the Bell monument to the right actually represents a local woman who had an interesting experience with Lord Cornwallis, who came to her mill to prepare flour for his soldiers. And she might have had some interesting exchange about whether or not he was going to burn her mill or she would do it herself to prevent the British from having the opportunity to prepare their grain. This is a picture of our more recent monument, and actually the most recent monument. This was placed in 2016. This is to the Crown Forces. So this was through the efforts of the modern Guilford Battleground Company. And this is an opportunity for us to teach people about the Crown Forces, or the British soldiers who were here. Lord Cornwallis had not only men from Britain, but also Wales and the Hessians and the Scots and the Irish. Excuse me. And by placing the Crown Forces Monument near the American First Line, it helps people understand where the British were approaching, as well as those who were involved. Excuse me a moment. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to people who are not actually physically memorialized at the battlefield, but we do talk about in our interpretation. There are African Americans who participated on both sides of the Army. They would have served in the Continental Line. Most likely, there could have been some in the militia as well as the Crown Forces. And you have men who are fighting who are enslaved as well as freed. Ned Griffin, to the left, is one of the more common stories that we're familiar with. He was actually made to serve in replacement for a man named William Kitchen. And Kitchen promised him his freedom after service, but actually then took back his word. So Ned Griffin had to petition, as you can see, to the General Assembly. In the Maryland Continental Line, we have a soldier named Thomas Carney, who had a long career of service. He was a freed man, most likely born free, and he chose, it seems, to be a career as a soldier versus staying just a farmer in Maryland, and fought in multiple battles throughout the Southern Campaign. And in his obituary, he states that he bayoneted 7 British at the third line. So pretty cool story. And we just like to take this point that even though they're not memorialized in stone, they still play an important part in our battle. All righty. So that's just some of the monuments that we have. We have 29. And like I said, I invite you all to come actually visit the battlefield so that you can explore them. And Benjamin has asked me to talk a little bit about the social history of the Guilford Courthouse community during this time. Now, these paintings are by Don Toriani. He actually made a series of paintings for Guilford Courthouse, which we have on display in our visitor center. And even though these don't necessarily depict the architecture of Guilford County, they still show what life was like during this time. Guilford County was predominantly a farming community with some other settlements, mainly the Quakers. But before we get to that, I just wanted to show you a painting of the courthouse. Now, as I said before, we don't have photographs. We don't have the original courthouse. So we really have to go off what artists have studied of the architectural history. However, a British sergeant, Roger Lamb, gave the most thorough description of the Guilford Courthouse that I've provided here for you. So it would have been a log structure, as you see. It would have had a V notch, which is a common way to chink these wooden logs together. However, the courthouse did not have a stone foundation, but he says that it was whitewashed, which means this would have had like a whitish appearance to it. And there would have been other buildings nearby, 2 small farmhouses and 3 barns. But it's just neat to see that this British soldier took the time in his memoirs to recount what the area looked like. So the after the battle actually brings a severe toll on the local population of the Quakers of Guilford County, specifically the New Garden Friends meeting. As we can see in this top picture, Troiani has depicted the soldiers after the battle. After the battle took place, it started to rain. There were reports of men left on the field, British and American, and their cries that so much had disturbed the locals. And the Quakers were responsible for taking care of both sides. This is an image of their meeting house but every home within a 10-mile radius became a field hospital. And these soldiers were not taken care of, or their wounds were not alleviated right away. Some of these soldiers stayed with the Quakers for months. So that put not only an economic toll on the Quakers, because it's winter time, you have to think about the food resources and the fact that the Quakers had lost food to raids by robbers who posed as soldiers on either side. But unfortunately, during this time, the disease smallpox was a very common breakout in soldier camps. So unfortunately, many of the Quakers contracted smallpox and died while they were fulfilling what they saw as their duty to aid these soldiers, even though they themselves did not believe in participating in war. In fact, they were triple taxed at the time for refusing to be involved in the conscription or the enlistment. I just wanted to give an opportunity to show what the New Garden community looks like during this time. This is a really cool resource because this was actually drawn by a 10-year-old at the time. And even though he might not have his perspective right, this young man, who was the son of Thomas Jessup, he witnessed the New Garden skirmish that happens right before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, hinted by the Great Battle. There's a skirmish between Tarleton and Henry Lee, and he makes this map that shows where each of his neighbors live, shows the location of the meeting house, shows the location of the skirmish, and makes a connection to what he called the Great Battle. Of course, you know, Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So I think it's pretty cool to see how a child can be so cognizant, not only spatially, but of great events happening, and then be able to record it on a piece of paper. So, going over a little bit, this has just been a quick overview of the battle, but we have so much more to offer. As you can see, we have a new YouTube channel, which is pretty cool. You just have to look for Guilford NPS, and you will find all these videos, not only about combat, but the different soldiers. We have author talks. We have 18th century recipes that we talk about, and a lot of cool opportunities to explore this time period. And we just rolled out the NPS app. This is for all national parks. There are now 423, and by downloading the NPS app, not only will you be able to explore our new cell phone tours, but anytime you go to a national park, you will be able to get all the tour information you need and all the pertinent information about the site. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Pull our Zoom chat up.
Yeah.
So we have
Thank
two
you.
questions. The first one asks, will the short section of Old Battleground be closed, allowing the joining of the two areas of GMP?
I actually am not sure, but any kind of questions related to park management can actually be forwarded to our superintendent, and you can find that information on our website, and he will be happy to answer those questions.
Wonderful. And then the last question that we have at the moment, if time permits, I would enjoy listening to Benjamin describe the March 14th encampment by the British in the Deep River area.
So I cannot give as thorough and as detailed of a history as Rebecca just provided us, but my great-grandfather, who was A.M. Briggs, wrote a description of the experiences of the short sketch of the activities of Cornwallis and the Deep River settlement in 1781. And, you know, there's not a lot of, there's not as interesting of a story as the battleground has, but he writes that that those who grew up during this period and many others always took great delight in recounting to young people the history and traditions they were so familiar with. And the very few of us living now who listen to these thrilling stories would not for a moment doubt their accuracy. And he talks about some of the details, including how the British Army, when they came to Deep River, Cornwallis camped just a few hundred yards south of Deep River Meeting House, which is today ceremoniously marked with a precision tune car repair place on Penny Road. That's where the old Beard House was. And that the Army was foraging here. They were trying to feed themselves. This would have been in the early spring, March of the year. So people would have had limited provisions by this late, but they foraged. They took all the grain they could. They had the mills. We had 3 primary mills here on the 2 prongs of the Deep River that were grinding away very quickly. And he writes here that yet with all these efforts, Cornwallis reported 2 days after the battle that his men had been without bread for 2 days. Mm-hmm. So, think of, we heard last month with our recount of Jamestown, how the British troops tried to steal the family milk cow. And Mrs. Mendenhall said, no, you're not going to steal our milk cow. There were a few British soldiers that were who died while they were being cared for in the meeting house, at a very old meeting house that long ago disappeared, but the new meeting house replaced it. And they are allegedly buried in the Deep River meeting cemetery. I think there were 3. And I've heard old timers write back in the 1800s, they wish as children they had listened more carefully to their elders when they described and pointed to the location of those graves, because nobody can remember exactly where they were. They are just outside the Quaker cemetery. And the last point about what it was like to live here is that I have heard that in Deep River area that you could hear the roar of cannon and gunshot. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me, but you could hear that something was happening up near in the area of Martinville without an S. And this is interesting just because it shows you the impact was not just in the New Garden community or in the Martinville community, but throughout all of Guilford County. This was a major disruption. We heard in our first talk in January about the Bugler Boy, young man who was slain between Summerfield and Oak Ridge. This had a major impact throughout all of Guilford County. So, we talk about, as Rebecca said at the very beginning, we think the Revolutionary War, some people think it just happened up in New England and New York and Philadelphia and Valley Forge. And boy, it happened here hard. We were right in the thick of it. And this is what's called a Pyrrhic victory. The British won, but Pyrrhic means that they named after a Greek battle, that they won the battle, but they didn't win the war, to put it bluntly. So what a key role we play in the Revolutionary War.
Definitely. And as you said, it hit so hard because this is the largest and bloodiest battle of the Southern campaign. And the events, as you said, being a Pyrrhic victory for the British, as I mentioned at the beginning, Lord Cornwallis has about 1,900 men under his command, whereas General Greene has 4,500. Well, Cornwallis loses a quarter of his army, and many of those are his commanders. So when you want to think about experience, you can't just replace a commander like you can replace a militiaman. So this battle ultimately causes Cornwallis to give up the Southern campaign and give up his hopes to be able to reassert royal authority here in the South. And he goes to Wilmington, North Carolina, and then moves north to Yorktown, which I'm sure many of our Revolutionary War enthusiasts and even new interested people are familiar with Yorktown. So, and to your point about the British foraging, Cornwallis actually burned his baggage trains, burned his food provisions, had his commanders pour out their rum rations so that they could speed up in their pursuit of General Greene. I mean, he was just so focused on destroying him. And the reason why Greene pulls away from the battlefield is at the third line action, Cornwallis's army comes at different points through the woods, but all of a sudden, the 2nd Maryland is swarmed by the British. And even though you have the cavalry action, Greene is not going to sacrifice his army for one battle. He deeply believed in saving his army for another fight. And even George Washington stressed to him the importance of keeping as much of his Continental soldiers alive as possible to fight another day. And he'll actually go south to continue routing out the British that are left.
And remember that George Washington did come here. He saw this as a pivotal point in the Americans seeking our independence, and on his great Southern tour in 1799, he visited Guilford County.
1970 or 1791.
1790.
We have the writer of George Washington's 1791 Southern Tour book listening to us at the moment.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And we actually have a monument to his visit at the battlefield as well.
So George Washington did come here and sleep here. So we have that feather in our cap as well.
Yeah, he slept somewhere, but we know that he at least visited the courthouse. But like I said, the courthouse itself no longer remains. So, but the historic New Garden Road does remain, and it's pretty cool that you can walk in the footsteps of the artillery, as well as the people who settled Guilford County. So you can step back into our park and just kind of try to visualize what life was like in the 1780s and even back to its founding.
Okay, we have one more question. Can you tell us about the roles that the French and the Hessians played?
So the Hessians sometimes really get a bad rap, thanks to history and the way history has been told. The Hessians are often commented as mercenaries, but it's a lot more complicated than that. They actually are underneath the principality that makes the decisions for their terms of service. Hessians would have served for 24 years, whereas the average American militiaman served about 3 months at a time. So the Hessians are a part of Lord Cornwallis's forces, and I can't go back to my map, but they veer off from the main action. And if you come to our park, we'll be able to show you where they were located on the battlefield. But the Hessians actually wear blue uniforms, and there was a point of confusion for the militia where they thought that they saw their compatriots in blue, raised their hats and shouted "Liberty, liberty," and then were fired upon. As far as the French is concerned, they don't have as much of a role here as they would in other battles, but are still an important part of American victory and supplying during the time.
Okay.
Well, what a fascinating lead. And there are so many books that have been written, both very early publications and more recent publications that people can find. I hope that if you're not familiar with this facet and this chapter of Guilford County history, that you'll be encouraged to visit Guilford Battleground and get an expert tour by very knowledgeable people, such as our guide, Rebecca, and others. And there are books that you can read more, their YouTube site, and it's just a wonderful jewel in Guilford County's crown that we have this historical resource right in the middle of our county for everybody to enjoy, even if you're just taking a morning run on the weekend or walking your dog. So we've just got a fantastic asset. If there's no other questions, let's see.
Oh, hold on.
one more, hopefully to see everybody at enactment in 2022. So there are enactments, and I'm sure with everybody recuperating from COVID, there will be some excitement to do those and get back to how things work.
Yeah, those do take place in Country Park next door, but this past our 240th, we had to go virtual, and we did have a few battlefield tours, but we look forward to the future when we can start re-engaging people at the site about the history.
Great. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I hope that you'll join us next month, which is National Historic Preservation Month, on Thursday, May 20th, the third Thursday of the month. We'll hear from Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson. She is a very prominent historic preservation leader here in North Carolina. She's currently the Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities and Professor of Sociology at Shaw University in Raleigh, but many of you remember her working with Bennett College here in Greensboro. She loves Greensboro, and she's going to talk with us about International Civil Rights Museum, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the jewels in our crown here in Guilford County that relate to diversity, African-American history, and telling the rest of the story that maybe hasn't been told as well as we should have told it in the past. But we're ready to tell these stories now and recognize and acknowledge the contributions that have been made by our citizens of all backgrounds, and especially those of African-American descent. So that will be our next talk in May in Preservation Month, and I hope that you'll all be able to join us at that time. And then we'll continue this momentum on into the rest of the year. We're busy identifying speakers for the summer and the fall. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.